Hey everybody, welcome to Life is Beautiful. I'm Anthony, and today we're going to be doing another episode of This Week in Beer. This is the segment of my channel where we go through and we talk about some of the hardest hitting news stories coming out of beer, brewing, all that fun stuff all around the globe. So this week's we really have one actual real story that I wanted to talk to you about, but I found a couple of little cheeky, funny little stories that I also just really wanted to talk about. So the first two stories aren't going to be that important, but stick around to the end for the real stuff. The first story is a little bit of U.S. news, but taking place in Iceland. This past week, over 6,000 U.S. and NATO troops came to Iceland to participate in a NATO-led exercise, and they actually ended up drinking out the entire supply of the capital city of Reykjavik. They drank out every single last drop of beer that Iceland could produce. It got so bad that the local breweries actually had to go into rush production and packaging mode to ship out more beer to the pubs and restaurants and everything. And according to the news sources that I found, even that was ravished. So at this point, I really don't know whether to be embarrassed or proud of my beer drinking culture, but it's even more impressive when you take into consideration the extreme cost of beer in Iceland. Oftentimes, a pint can go for $10 to $12 plus. So either that exercise really sucked and they needed a brew, or hey, we like to party. Either way, it is kind of impressive, so go America. Don't worry if you were planning a trip there, they have completely restocked since, so all things are back to normal. So it's good to see we didn't cause any long-lasting damage, and to the people of Iceland, either you're welcome or sorry, depending on how y'all feel about it. Now, even though I didn't know how to feel about that last story, our next story, I 100% do know how to feel about it. Coming out of Brooklyn, New York, there was a man who has officially registered his beer as an emotional support animal. This cheeky asshole left a statement saying, "I travel from upstate to Brooklyn a lot, and on the bus they say it's a federal crime to smoke or have an alcoholic beverage, unless by prior written consent. And I've always wondered where you get that consent." I love a good loophole. So he ended up registering his beer with the American Service Dog Registration Service, which is a privately owned, non-government connected entity, mind you. And surprisingly, or non-surprisingly, depending on how your feelings are about America's current support animal culture, they approved him, sent him the official documentation, gave him a service dog number and everything for his delicious little brew. And this documentation is supposed to help with the validity of him needing an emotional support service animal to help him with social anxiety. I mean, I do get it. Having ridden public transport for the first time in 2019, a couple of beers would have helped. So, what do I feel about this story? One, I love a good loophole. One, I love somebody sticking it to the man. And I really like the idea of somebody taking the piss out of both the government, because there's absolutely no reason that people shouldn't be able to kick back a couple brewskis on a bus, you know? I mean, if you look at anywhere in Europe, that's happening constantly. Secondly, I'm not a huge fan of the support animal culture that is kind of running rampant in America. Now, don't get me wrong, I 100% support service dogs. Official, trained, licensed, take care of you if you have a disability or a need or whatever. I support that. What I don't support are people who are like, "I want my dog to go on a plane because it's a good picture for Instagram." I don't like that. And a lot of these private corporations, such as the one that this man went through, all you have to do is send in a little fee and they send you a certificate, and it has no legal backing. It's just people feeling entitled, trying to make a loophole for themselves to be able to do whatever they want, which I guess in a way I also respect. So I like the idea that he really made a farce out of them, because it shows just how non-genuine they are. If they're like, beer, and they're like, yeah, that's a dog. But it is important to note, like I said, that his registration of the beer is probably completely non-legally backing, and that if he did actually crack open a cold one on a bus and showed his little certificate, he would probably still be fined or arrested. You actually need to get a doctor's prescription or a doctor's recommendation to have those emotional support animals to back you up and everything like that. And he just doesn't have that. But I will say, there is precedent for this. Back during America's Prohibition, Winston Churchill actually came over to the United States to do some official duties or whatever. And he had his doctors write him a prescription saying he needed like a fuck ton of alcohol in order to stay resilient or whatever. But, I mean, I guess if this dude wanted to push it, there is legal precedent. But I do agree that you do help me with my social anxieties. Good boy. All right, our last story, one that is actually important. We have some really cool news coming out of China. If you've been watching my channel for any extended period of time, you know that I love ancient beer history. And this is one of the coolest archaeological beer discoveries I've ever seen or heard of. Scientists analyzing ancient Chinese amphoras, beer vessels, dating back over 6,000 years ago, have discovered possibly the first documented case of experimentation and possible desire for variation within beer. In this small archaeological dig site of Yangshao, scientists have discovered a multitude of amphoras, some reaching up to like over 1 meter tall and 1 meter wide. I mean, these are big vessels. So they went through and they did a DNA chemical analysis of the contents that used to be contained within these vessels that had been soaked into the porous nature of the clay pots. And they were able to discover and recreate the chemical listing of what the beers were made out of and their alcoholic content and all that stuff. And they came up with a very interesting discovery. And that is, being brewed at the exact same time, there were a multitude of different beers being brewed in Yangshao at the same time. They were able to see that these beers were brewed with malts at different phases of their life cycle, indicating that these ancient brewers were actually trying to identify when was the best time to turn malt into beer. Like they had already grasped the concept. All right, malt plus water equals beer, good, delicious, alcoholic stuff. But they didn't know when or how, so they were experimenting it. Some just fresh and raw, some already sprouting, some completely rotted and molded. And this is really cool because as far as I know, as far as my research has told me, this is really the first time that we have seen purposeful experimentation with malts and grains to make better beer. Now, don't get me wrong, I am sure that other ancient brewing cultures like Egyptians, Sumerians, whatever, I'm sure that they did this same process and they did this same experimentation to create higher quality products. But I think this is the very first time that we've actually had a window into this, the actual documentation, visual, physical evidence of seeing it in practice. Now, a second theory to the quality argument is that there is a possibility that they were actually just trying to experiment with variation. We do know that several thousand years later, there were two extremely well-defined beer styles in ancient Chinese beer culture. But to create those two solidified definitions, I mean, there would have had to been so much experimentation learning how to brew and change the processes and ingredients, and this seems to be the origin, the catalyst event that created all this experimentation. And that's also extremely interesting because when you look at ancient beer brewing cultures from 6,000 years to slightly before that, you see that they mostly stuck to the same ingredient. They learned, okay, water plus heat plus grain, barley, whatever, eventually equaled beer, and they just kept at it, maybe adding some additional things to it for flavor or to enhance it in some way medically or religiously, but you never really saw them going out of their way to try different ingredients and build up a whole new style of beer from the ground up unless there was a shortage in ingredients or something was wrong with their equipment and they had to change their process. But these ancient Chinese beer brewers were going out of their way, like, okay, we're learning how to make it better. Let's learn how to make new things so we can make that better too. All around, it just captures the magic of what beer brewing is about. 6,000 years later, we are still doing these same experiments. And I just think that's really, really cool that we were able to gain this insight into this one unifying beer mentality. So I guess it kind of goes to show that as much as things change, they stay the same. Either way, this was extremely cool, and I was so excited to read it and share it with y'all. So hopefully y'all enjoyed it. This concludes This Week in Beer. There wasn't a whole lot of beer news this week, a couple of like beer releases or whatever, but those are whack. Pliny the Younger's coming out in bottles, so go get it or whatever. But thank you very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something, and hopefully you were entertained with those first two stories. So thank you very much. Like, comment, subscribe. Remember, there is a story in every bottle, and that life is beautiful. Cheers.